I am not a crook. These words were uttered by one of the presidents of the United States. This president was accused of various slanderous charges. The president I am referring to is President Richard Nixon. The only things history will remember of Nixon will be his controversies and failed second term. But his life is what makes up the man. His life shows that there are very few scandals and controversies. Let's start at the beginning. Nixon was born on January 9, 1913, in Yorba Linda, California. According to Bio.com, he was born into poverty and said, quote, "We are poor, but the glory of it was that we didn't know it," unquote. He had a few siblings, two of which died. In 1925, his younger brother died, and in 1933, his older brother died of tuberculosis. This brother had a great impact on him and influenced him greatly. Nixon's education is nothing that is fancy or high. His education is no different than any others. He went to public high school, to be exact. He began high school at Fullerton High and then moved to Whittier High. While he attended Whittier High in Whittier, California, Nixon decided to run for class president. He lost that race. Upon graduating high school, Nixon was offered a scholarship to Harvard University. He turned it down and went to Whittier College. He then attended Duke University Law School. It was his last law degree. It was this last law degree Nixon got started on during the presidency. Nixon became a small-town lawyer and was offered a job to work for the Roosevelt administration. He worked for the Office of Price Administration. Despite not having to serve, Nixon joined the Navy. He rose to the rank of lieutenant commander and was an aviation ground officer in the Pacific. He resigned his commission in January 1946, just 2 years of service. When he returned to America, he decided that he would run for office. He ran for Congress against Jerry Voorhis. He ran as a Republican, and during the race he exploited Jerry Voorhis' sympathies for communism. This ultimately led to his election. He was elected in November 1946. He was assigned to the Committee of Foreign Aid and helped oversee the implementation of the Marshall Plan. Alger Hiss is an important figure in Nixon's first term as congressman. Hiss was a former State Department official who was suspected of being a communist spy. During the interrogation before Congress, Nixon convinced, more or less tricked, Hiss to admit to being a spy. This gave Nixon the reputation of being an anti-communist activist. 4 years later, Nixon decided to run for the Senate. He was elected in 1950. He also received the nickname Tricky Dicky at this time. He received this nickname because of the way he campaigned. Because of his success in Congress, Nixon received the honor of being asked to run for vice president with Dwight D. Eisenhower. They were elected into office in 1952. There was some controversy during the campaign. Malsberger states that Nixon was a central role in the fund crisis. The fund crisis was where Nixon was receiving improper funds for political gain. In Checker's speech, Nixon refuted all these claims, but according to Bio.com, he only admitted to accepting one gift. The gift was a Cocker Spaniel that his daughter named Checkers. While vice president, the office expanded. The way his office expanded was by the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This amendment allows the vice president to take over the presidency when the president is incapacitated. Another huge piece of legislation was passed during his vice presidency, the Civil Rights Bill of 1957. This bill allows every citizen, regardless of color, gender, or literacy, to vote. Nixon's presidency started off shaky. He decided to run for president in 1960, but he lost to John F. Kennedy, according to History.com. This loss started a losing streak for Nixon. He decided to run for governor of California and lost it too. 8 years later, Nixon was ready to give it another try. He announced his bid for presidency in February 1968. There was great speculation about if he could win or not. His campaign got a huge boost when President Lyndon B. Johnson announced that he was not running. This and the death of Robert Kennedy led to his election as the 37th President of the United States. As President, Nixon was conscious of various different social and civil disparities. He took the civil disparities head on. He created a bureaucratic committee for education, and he crafted a task force for women's rights. This task force brought sex discrimination to the ideas of many. They influenced the government and made it mandatory for all federal contracts to have sex discrimination guidelines. Social disparities were ever growing. The focus was on the environment. Nixon passed the Clean Air Act in 1970. This act created one of the most influential federal agencies in history. The Environmental Protection Agency was created. This act also created the Department of Natural Resources, which was to oversee the national parks. Nixon had an enormous task at hand, too. He had to deal with the Vietnam War. This was highly opposed. Nixon, however, viewed it as necessary. It was to contain communism. Nixon did, however, make an agreement with the USSR. It was called the SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This treaty put a limit on the USSR, and American arms race. It limited the number of nuclear weapons both countries could have. Another reason the Vietnam War ended was because of the increased foreign affairs with China. According to Lockhart, Lockhart states that his communication with China and America helped the Chinese gain entry to the United Nations. They both showed hostility to the USSR. The final chapter in Nixon's political career is the untimely exit during his second term. This abrupt departure was from the Watergate scandal. The scandal began with the organization CREEP, Committee to Re-elect the President. They illegally went into the Democratic National Convention headquarters to retrieve information about the Democratic candidate. There were recordings of the meeting between Nixon and the CREEP. Nixon refused to release these tapes, but according to Time magazine, he did allow Senator John Stennis to hear them and be the judge. The Supreme Court, however, made Nixon release these tapes. In response to impeachment, Nixon became the first president to resign from office. He resigned on August 9, 1974. The death of Nixon occurred 20 years later in 1994. He died on April 22, 1994, just 10 months after his beloved wife. He died in New York of a stroke. The life of Richard Nixon was overshadowed by the corruption and the conspiracies, but he helped usher in the new age of the 20th century. According to the White House .gov, some of Nixon's policies are still in effect today. President Obama is using the President's Export Council, created by Nixon, to increase and hopefully double exports of America. It is through his life we can examine the man that was Richard Nixon and the lasting efforts he has on history.